Hi, this is Anita, the Global Trade Gal. One of the things that if you're in the global supply chain that you need to be able to understand, no matter which part of the supply chain you're at, whether you're a supplier at the very beginning of the supply chain or you're somebody at the very end of the supply chain, is to understand a little bit about containers. Containers are those things I always like to say to people who don't really know what a container is. When you're in a place like the United States or Europe and you see those big trucks and they've got that metal container on the back of them, those really big metal containers are usually a 40-foot container, a 40-foot high queue, and the smaller ones are 20. They're the containers that you'll see put on trains, you'll see them put on trucks, and those containers are the ones that we will bring in by truck and we will load up. And we've loaded a lot of containers. In fact, my staff's loading one today. We're loading one next week. We load a lot of containers. And our containers are not like just one item in one container, which some people do. Our containers are very much mixed containers, which is essentially a much harder way to be able to load a container than a container which is one item. And let me explain and tell you the reason why. One reason is because if you have a set box and you quickly use a computer software, and there's a lot of great computer softwares out there which tell you exactly how to load it. But if you have many different types of items, it can be a lot more complicated. As a general rule, the bigger, heavier pieces should go on the bottom and the lighter ones should go on top. That just makes sense. Yeah, but at the same time, you need to be able to always load the container to be able to maximize the space. And this is what is really key and important, in that the space must be maximized completely, because you want to make sure that you will be able to ship everything that you can into that container. That's why when you have many different sizes and boxes and many different things, it can be difficult. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure the container is tight. Why? Because that container throughout the shipment process is going to get moved around. It's going to go from our warehouse where we load it and we seal it up, and then the truck will take it to the port, and of course along the way, there could be bumps in the road and other things which, if it's not tight, suddenly your goods will start jumping up and down within that container and could get broken. And then it will get loaded with a crane, onto the ship, and then you can't really say which part of the ship it goes on. You can't say whether there's going to be containers on top of it, if it's going to be at the bottom, if it's going to be at the top. You really don't have a say for that. That's up to the shipping company themselves. And then once it gets to its destination, it gets loaded off the ship again, gets put on a truck, and gets brought to another, usually a warehouse where it's distributed out. All of that is quite a bit of movement. It's quite a bit of weather it could go through. A container of goods could go through from very hot in one place to extremely wet and cold in another place. Again, you would have no control over that. So all of these things matter when it comes to products, how containers are loaded, and essentially in the quality of the product itself. That's why you want to make sure that you pack a container as tight as you can to save as much space as possible in the container. Every single inch of that container costs money to ship. So if you leave a container that's partly empty, then of course, you're basically leaving money on the table, which you wouldn't need to if you had packed it or shipped it properly. The other thing that you need to really understand when you're loading a container and when you're getting a container into load is the one thing that we always check for is if there's any holes in the container. Now, this is really not our responsibility ourselves. This is responsible of the shipping company. But those containers, they're out of metal. A lot of them get rusted out. And if there's a hole in the container and the container goes through very wet conditions and suddenly water comes in, then your goods could become damaged. So we, as a matter of course, will always check and make sure that the container doesn't have any holes. One of the easiest ways to do that is you get in the container, close the door, look for any light shining through to see if there's any holes shining through. Sometimes if there's small holes, we can kind of patch it up a bit. We'll patch it up a bit and let it go. If it's a really big hole, we may actually return the container and say, this container is not seaworthy. You want to make sure that you have a container which is seaworthy. Why? Because there again, there's so many things that can happen, which the container will be out of your control when you're loading the container and by the time it reaches its destination. That's why all of these things are important to do, to look at the waterproofing of the container and to look at all of the other things that the container could go through while on the sea. The other thing you want to do is you really want to make sure when you lock the container that the container is actually fully locked. This, of course, is also very important, that the container is fully locked down. You want to make sure of that so there is no problem that the container doesn't suddenly, they're loading the container onto the ship and suddenly the crane lifts it up and the door flies open and all your goods fly out and there goes everything. You don't want that to happen. I've never had that happen to us, but I'm sure that has happened sometimes. It's just the nature of this business. You're sure that many different things have happened in that way. But there again, you want to make sure your container is completely locked down and sealed before you take it to the port. Also, too, it becomes part of the, the process. You're turning the container over to the shipping company. And you want to be sure that all your goods arrive, that goods are not missing. We have had, several times where, containers have been maybe opened due to customs or other things. And the customer's like, well, why wasn't it repacked properly or other things? Because sometimes even the customs officials do not repack it properly. So you really need to follow that container, understand the container, and know what's going on with the container until it reaches its final destination. There's many things that you need to look at too when you are shipping a container. Is all containers will have a kind of weight to them. If you're shipping something which is extremely heavy, then you need to really look at the weight. If it's things that are lighter, the weight may not matter so much. But the weight load limit is something which you also need to look at when you are loading a container. You need to also understand the impact of safety and compliance. That I've talked a bit about this, about that, that things, if the container tips, if it shifts, if there's other things that go on, that it really will, the container will be able to remain safe. This, of course, is another important aspect of your ability to be able to load the container properly. And it's also a reason why you want to make sure that the container is packed tight and there's not a lot of movement within the container itself. If we ever have a container that is part empty for whatever reason, we will try to tie down as much as we can to tie down the cargo in there. We've even in the past, we put in some empty boxes in there to make sure that it was more tight and would be tied down. We put some string in there. We just really make sure that whatever it is, that it's packed tight in there so it can safely be able to get to its destination. So we've written a blog post on this, about the container loading. And I think, one of the most important things on this is that, in today's world, there's so much in technology you can do to help you. In fact, these programs which tell you exactly how to load a container are fantastic. If you're able to get one of those programs which will tell you exactly what will load in, where they should load, you can put in the carton size, the weight, and they will basically, make it easy for you. A caution of that is that, but if the carton size is off even like 1 mm, sometimes, which is very little, sometimes you may not be able to load exactly all you think you can load into a container. So it really does become a bit of a trial and error. It, really does become, you having to really understand and the actual loading process. Even no matter how well you planned, sometimes it doesn't load exactly the way you think it will. And you have to, be quick, and you have to, think on your feet when you're loading a container in order to maximize the container load. James Johnson, my co-author on this blog, has written a blog post entitled Mastering Container Loading. And we'll put a link in the description if you'd like to be able to read more about what he's written on this and some of his thoughts versus some of my thoughts on this. We hope that you've enjoyed this, and we thank you for being part of our community. If you have any questions on containers or container loading, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.